Hello and welcome back. I'm Steve Murphy, a trust and estates attorney with McGuire Woods LLP, and this is Legacy Planning Once Removed, my podcast on estate planning, taxes, legacy, property, and everything else on my clients' minds. Well, here we are as I record this. It's November 2024. We're getting towards the end of the year, and so we all know what time it is. It's gifting time and inflation adjustment time. Here's what I mean by that. In our planning, there are some specific numbers that we try to keep in mind related to gifting. And in fact, these numbers these days are really on our clients' minds. You'll recall that we've talked about the estate tax exemption or estate tax exclusion that currently allows each individual to transfer $10 million indexed for inflation to various individuals. There's other deductions for transfers to a U.S. citizen, spouse, or charities, but that $10 million number is on our clients' minds. But as we talked about in our recent episode 30, that exemption of $10 million indexed for inflation per person is scheduled to be cut in half to $5 million indexed for inflation at the end of 2025. Again, we talked about this on episode 30. It's called Countdown to Sunset 2025, Planning in the Face of Scheduled Changes in the Law. And of course, whether that exemption actually sunsets will be affected by the recent election results. So we'll all be monitoring that closely. But that really should be the topic of another episode. That is, what to expect based on the recent election. In another episode, episode 16, we talked about an efficient way to make gifts each year if the client wishes to make those kinds of gifts. And in that episode, we talked about a couple of options available. We talked about making those gifts outright, or maybe in a minor's account to a minor, maybe to a 529 educational account, or maybe to a trust. And we talked about all the advantages and disadvantages of those different options. In preparing for this episode, I looked back to that episode, and that episode, I think it really covers that menu really well. It's called episode 16. So as you're thinking about different options of how to make these gifts, I'd encourage you to check back to that episode 16. But this episode, I think we can keep it relatively brief. And I just want to report on the inflation adjustments for some key numbers for estate planning for 2025. These were just released by the IRS in a particular revenue procedure called 2024-40. They release these inflation adjustments each year. The document itself from the IRS is 27 pages. There's all sorts of inflation adjustments they put out each year. But I want to focus on 3 or maybe 4 numbers. Okay, the first inflation adjustment. It's that estate and gift tax exemption amount. It's actually technically called the basic exclusion amount. That's the amount that anyone can give total during life and upon death to individuals, again, other than a U.S. citizen spouse or certain charities. So that number is currently $10 million indexed for inflation. For 2024, that number was $13.61 million. For 2025, that number is $13.99 million per person. That gets us awfully close to 14 million. I really wish the IRS had just rounded up a little bit more. That would have made all our discussions and calculations and flowcharts a little bit easier. But this is the official number, $13.99 million. That's obviously a lot of money. And keep in mind that at the end of 2025, under current law, that exemption is scheduled to essentially be cut in half to 5 million indexed for inflation. So when clients think about gifting to consider in 2025, they might think about making additional gifts of that inflation adjusted amount. Maybe they've made gifts in the past of the rest of their exclusion amount. Well, in 2025, they can give a little bit more. And importantly, they'll also have the same amount of GST tax exemption that they could allocate to those transfers. So again, consider some of those types of gifts in 2025. The second important inflation adjustment number is what we call the annual exclusion for gifts. This is the amount that a donor can give to essentially anyone in the world without paying gift tax or using any gift tax exemption. For calendar year 2025, that number is $19,000. For 2024, it was $18,000. For 2025, it'll be $19,000, and again, per person. So as clients are thinking about whether to make those kinds of gifts each year, then for 2025, they might think about starting to make those gifts in January of $19,000 per person. Now, as a side note, there's also an amount that a person can give to a non-US citizen spouse each year without using any gift tax exemption. And that number is a little bit different. That number adjusted for inflation for 2025 is $190,000. Now, maybe I just raised that to remind everyone that a lot of these rules operate differently if your spouse is not a US citizen, even if your spouse is a US permanent resident. But if your spouse is not a US citizen, there's different rules that apply. And then the third number I like to point out is the inflation adjustment for the point at which an estate or trust starts to pay income tax at the highest marginal rate. That is, when does it enter that highest tax bracket? So for 2025, estates and trusts will start to pay income tax the highest marginal rate once they reach income of $15,650. That's a low number. That's not a typo. That's not a misstatement. Compare that to the amount of income at which a married couple filing jointly will start to pay income tax the highest marginal rate. For 2025, that number for married couples is $751,600. So again, estates and trusts generally would pay income tax at a higher marginal rate. But when we talk about income taxation of trust, I'd like to remind you of just the overall purpose of the trust, and I'd refer you back to episode 7, where I talk about trust income tax. In that episode, I talked about how trusts are taxed, but I also warned about paying too much attention to this number, to this potential extra income tax a trust might have to pay. Instead, I'd encourage everyone to think about the overall goals of the trust that might include asset protection and asset management and estate tax savings and the like. And then, yes, also factor in potential income tax issues and how that might affect a client's planning decisions, and also how that might affect the administration and distributions from the trust. So there we have it, these key inflation adjustments for 2025. As you start to plan out your 2025 gifting, keep these numbers in mind, but also keep your overall strategies in mind. Again, I refer you back to that episode 16. I talked about some of these options. And as always, be sure to check with your advisors before taking any steps. Once again, I'm Steve Murphy, and this has been Legacy Planning Once Removed, my podcast on thoughtful planning. Thanks for listening.